everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, the podcast of the Conflict Law Center. Today, we're going to be talking to you about Bagram detainees, and we're very delighted to have with us Sarah Belal. Barrister Sarah Belal is an Executive Director of Justice Project Pakistan, as well as a recipient of the 2016 Franco-German Human Rights Prize and the Echoing Green Global Fellowship in 2013. Justice Project Pakistan is a non-profit organization based in Lahore that represents the most vulnerable Pakistani prisoners facing the harshest punishments at home and abroad. In December 2016, JPP was awarded the National Human Rights Award presented by the President of Pakistan. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start off by just asking you about the facts of the case in terms of why were there Pakistani prisoners in Bagram, what they were doing there, and how they came to be repatriated. And I just really want to highlight JPP's really important role. So when I was looking at this, I was just like, okay, this really started with you guys filing litigation in the Lahore High Court in 2010, applying pressure, and then you saw their repatriation happen in 2014. It was not in small part due to JPP just ensuring that these people weren't forgotten. And also, if we could talk a little bit about how, after they were repatriated, what legal challenges they faced upon coming back.
Sure. So that's a lot. But we started, when we started filing the case, the principle that we were going on, which is one of our favorite principles, and we still actually have litigated many subsequent cases on that principle, is basically a Pakistani citizen's constitutional right under Article 4, which basically everyone thinks about it as being the due process clause, but actually Pakistan's constitution is kind of special and very progressive in the way that the due process clause also has an element of it which actually gives you consular protection. Right. That's a constitutional right. This is a doctrine, right? The doctrine of consular protection is something that is now gaining a lot of speed, especially with the ex-rapporteur's, Agnes Calamar's excellent report on the subject. But our constitution always had that fundamental right in here. So it means that every Pakistani has a right to be treated in accordance with the law wherever they may be.
Right.
And that's what we used as the backbone of going to the Lahore High Court, saying that here were Pakistani citizens who were being detained in a neighboring country under a power, whoever the controlling power at that time, which was the United States, and are being held with all of their due process rights being violated. So obviously the first question would be, well, how on earth can the Lahore High Court order the Americans to release Pakistani citizens? And that's where the beauty of our constitution came, where we said, we're not asking the Honorable Court to be passing, any judgment against the United States of America. What we need the court to do is to enforce, to make sure, right? So judicially review the actions that are being taken by the government of Pakistan in respect of Article 4, right? Yeah. We know their due process rights are being violated. Here's, all of the documentation of it. What is our government doing to uphold that? And that's the principle which the Lahore High Court followed then in a continuing mandamus for over 4 years, which actually led to their repatriation, because they forced our government to start making more forceful representations, documenting, blah, 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 blah. And over 4 years, the Lahore High Court basically oversaw the repatriation and release of these prisoners.
Okay, nice. And I kind of want to get into a little bit the international law framework. We had a little bit of a brief discussion before we started the podcast about what applies. And the whole notion that they were really falling into this kind of legal black hole where you had to rely then on domestic Pakistani law to be applied extraterritorially to this Afghan prison, rather than something that you could rely on international law and take that to the court. And I was also reading this report which talked about 2014, Army Lieutenant Colonel Miles Kaggins, a Pentagon spokesperson for detention, was like, the Pakistanis are being held there under the laws of war and in safe, humane detention. And then the reports came out, and it was very shocking to see how much they were being tortured, and it was definitely not safe. It was definitely not humane. And this also differs from other accounts by the Americans, which were like, these are enemy combatants. The laws of war don't apply. We're not going to hold them to the Geneva Conventions, which then they took that back in Iraq, but in Afghanistan, that was definitely their opinion of what laws applied. So do you think that classification, this kind of legal black holeness, these kind of legalese, which was, nobody could really understand what law was being applied, do you think that really denied them the rights that they would otherwise be entitled to, and their legal status also played a part in that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, as lawyers, and especially lawyers that are trying to do strategic litigation or human rights law, it's really important for us to understand a certain couple of base truths, right? The law is political. The law is about power, right? And if you are looking to challenge power, then you have to view it, I think the problem again is law school, because I think they teach us to be so focused on this thing that they forget, that if you're not looking at everything in its context and its larger context, you're not going to understand the power. You're not going to understand the very force that you're trying to fight against. You're missing out an entire kind of strategy, a whole world of strategy, because you're just focused on, well, this is what they said, and this is what the law says, and this is what we're going to say, and this is what the court is going to say. In my experience, the law has never worked like that. It might be the field that I'm in, but it's never worked out by that. But every time that we have looked at the power that we're trying to speak truth to or to hold accountable, when we've looked at them in their context and understood that context and played with that context, we've had a better result with the court, outside the court, with the power, whatever. So even in that context, we talked about this. I have witnessed endless squabbling, at some of the highest, most accomplished international organizations, at conferences, endlessly speaking about this distinction in international law, that the Americans had created through pure American exceptionalism.
Completely.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, there is no argument. You saw a country violate the Geneva Conventions blatantly. You should have just called him out on that. Why are you engaging in this conversation of, are there enemy combatants? Are they this? It really doesn't matter. And it didn't matter because they were exerting power, right? Unjustly, and doing whatever they wanted in Afghanistan. And because everybody became distracted by, well, we're going to figure out how to get around this memo and come up with a legal argument. That's not what got these guys out. That's also not what held them to account. Guantanamo Bay, right? Those detainees got the right to be represented by a lawyer because the US Supreme Court, right, talked about the constitutional amendment, or whatever. I'm a British lawyer, not an American one, but it talked about how that was a constitutional right. They didn't extend that to Afghanistan, but what got these guys out of Afghanistan was Pakistan's constitution. Right? So, but meanwhile, internationally, everyone's still talking about, how international, well, I don't mind talking about, let's call a spade a spade. Let's talk about how international law failed, how it was flouted, how it relies on big powers to actually go along with it, and how it should be a lesson for all of us, especially, NGOs in those powers, on how easily they got distracted by whatever the US administration was trying to, throw them a bone with, and what actually worked. Right? So, sorry for that bit of a rant.
No, it's totally fine. I completely agree with you in the sense that, the third world approach to international law has to be so much stronger in terms of how the global south reacts to all of these issues. And also that I was reading a report about this, which was looking at the ICRC and international lawyers, like you rightly said, being like, wait, is this an occupation? Is this a non-international armed conflict? Is this an international armed conflict? Wait, how could they be enemy combatants? And giving the Americans arguments that they'd never even made. They were like, okay, maybe under this provision, they could be arguing that they're flouting the laws of war.
I've been in those rooms and I wanted to pull out my hair. And thank God at that time I was too young. I didn't understand international law. I didn't take it in university. And so for me, it was like, okay, as a lawyer, I can sort of understand the arguments, even though I don't know the principles. But even then, because of my naivety, thank God, because I think if I'd studied international law, we would have been paralyzed and would have not brought this challenge.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. It's because we didn't. And I was in those rooms and I saw all of these organizations endlessly hair splitting over what the US administration had thrown at them. That because I didn't understand, 40% of it, I was able to say this is bullshit. It doesn't, I'm sorry for saying bullshit, but it doesn't mean anything to the people on the ground that are being held. And this endless thing is not going to help you get them out either. So what are we doing here? They all were very upset at me making that comment. Again, the folly of youth. But I agree. Like, it's just, come on, I mean, there's a power disparity that is built into international law. The Geneva Conventions were, now that I've done international law, I think they're a beautiful set of ideas.
I agree.
think they're worth defending.
Yeah,
but
completely.
they need to evolve. And the war on terror has shown how utterly they fail that paradigm. And you have enough history under that paradigm now for 20 years to be able to take it on. Also, because they were post World War II one, that's why they don't fit into the war on terror paradigm. And also, let's remember that the people who are harbingers of this system, right, even of international law, whether it's the powers or organizations like the ICRC, are also the people who decide, essentially, right? What is an international armed conflict and not, and let's keep that in mind as a context when we talk about it. Because
and equally, in what ways they allow the stretching of the laws of war. So I agree with you. I read the Geneva Conventions and I'm like, I really find them so inspiring, beautiful documents in the sense that, okay, all of these countries in 1949 that came together, they just seen the brutality, horrors of the Second World War, and they agreed to give each other's prisoners of war such extensive protections. You can't deny a prisoner of war his tobacco ration because that would violate the Geneva Conventions. They were completely, incredibly comprehensive. And we saw that with Abhinandan when he landed, right? That you couldn't film him having a cup of chai. Like that's against the Geneva Conventions, protect these people. But at the same time, where they fail, and also where they fail, we've seen that going into Iraq. We've seen that the Americans
spectacularly
just sit there
fail,
and be like, they're not going to be applied. And now you have Russia doing that in Ukraine, and everyone's like, sanction them to the ends of the earth, and also have a tribunal.
So there's another reason why they failed so spectacularly, in my opinion. Actually, not just in my opinion, it's fairly obvious, and the Ukraine example really highlighted that, is that there is an absolute racial inequity, right? This is about brown bodies, right? That's what the war on terror was about. And it was about brown bodies. And suddenly, those bodies were not as important as arguing endlessly about the legalese of international law, right? Whereas when you have the Ukraine-Russia crisis, apart from the geopolitical situation of it being in Europe, but it was widely covered by progressive networks, how even it was being reported as, these are not just your typical refugees, excuse me. And everybody, all of the white networks were talking about it like that.
And we even had stuff in British newspapers being like, this is what you can do for the war effort. I was like, the war effort?
And people asking you to donate in the UK endlessly. And I had friends calling me back saying, I will donate to that cause when, so there wasn't enough Ukraine refugees to be given housing. And people were saying, well, we want to give housing. And people were like, well, what about the Syrians?
Exactly.
And they need housing. Are you opening your house to them? No, thank you. We want those kind of refugees. So, I mean, look, law is political. Law is about power. Law is also a reflection of a society's thing. So the international legal framework of the Geneva Conventions coming out of the Second World War is, in its context, when you take it in its context, you understand why it failed in the war on terror. So now the global south or whatever should push back against it and force it to evolve.
Completely.
Right? But I refuse to engage with it to the level that we talk about the legalese of it, in the sense that, to me, it's again going back. I don't want to have the discussion about enemy combatants and detainees. Right? I want to talk about how you will fix your targeting, how you will fix, who you qualify or what qualifies as an armed conflict or non-international armed conflict, your laws of targeting, your laws of this, that really take into consideration the 20 years or even longer of conflict in the global south that has been perpetrated by, the north. And where are those experiences, kind of reflected in the conventions? And I think I was horrified because I only got to go on this course for international law, I think 2018 or 20. I was horrified that that's still the standard that was being propagated after so much. And I couldn't understand. There were other people in that course from Cuba, and there was a bunch of diplomats also, where I was just like, why are we not screaming about this? Where is Geneva Convention 5 or 6? They need to be rewritten. That's the first conversation that needs to happen about the Geneva Convention. Sorry.
And I agree with you. And I also feel like lawyers from the global south, and I always be on this drum whenever I'm teaching as well, that we need to know everything so we can pick it apart. Because there was so much ink spilled about enemy combatants. There is no field of enemy combatants. You're either a civilian or you're a combatant. That's it. There is no third category that you can place everyone, and that's it. That argument should have been done.
Yeah.
But instead you're there, like you're laboriously like poring over it and like talking about, oh, but the Americans did this. Oh, but we had one case in 1950. And this is what the Americans are really good at doing.
Yeah.
They don't go into Iraq without 3,000 lawyers.
Yeah.
And we don't even, I mean, there's nobody working on war law in Pakistan. Like the amount of people working, there's a handful of people.
Yeah.
And you need the same army to go in and be like, pick these arguments apart and also be like, this is what we think. And
but I think there's a reason so I completely agree that I was shocked when I went on this course that, I mean, I almost got kicked out of it because, because as an experienced lawyer, just even in domestic stuff, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of non-lawyers on the course, like diplomats and this kind of stuff. But the problem was that as the lawyer, whenever they'd say something about, well, this is an international non-conflict, this is a non-international, I'd be like, well, who decides? Nobody really decides. And I was like, but doesn't it say that you guys are the ones that basically have to propagate it? Yes. And I was like, well, who decided in Afghanistan? Well, nobody decided in Afghanistan. I was like, didn't you guys have a memo that came out? And wasn't that basically the thing to the war? Oh, well, yes, but we're not the only one. Well, yeah, you might not be the only ones, but your opinion is the main one that counts. And when you did, this is the consequences of it. So that's why I was like, that was lesson number 1 and I almost got kicked out. So I agree. We need to know about this law in order to be able to challenge it. But what happens with what are the lessons from the war on terror experience is something much more far-reaching and damaging. Because what you've seen is it's like you saw the United States exceptionalism. But because they did it, and they did it so blatantly, and they created all of these, ridiculous kind of exceptions in the law, we saw domestic actors, right, other countries, just copy and pasting exactly their procedure and using it against their own citizens.
Yes.
And we saw this globally. And that effect is still going on. Right? So I agree with you that, we need to be advising our people also. And it's actually eroding. Like, I don't think today, if we went to the court on the same principle, that we would have had that amount of success. Because in that time, this topic of this being exceptionalist, whatever, was still unthought of because it was only the United States that was, waging this in a very blatant manner, right? Creating these DRBs and military courts. Now we have had that experience ourselves.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's like, okay, they create the handbook and that it's unfair and it's terrible. And then you kind of end up applying it. And it was really interesting to see that, okay, these detainees in Bagram were treated horribly. The accounts of torture, it just sounds like it was absolutely brutal. And then I was reading a report where someone was like, hey, so we couldn't link you to the bad guys. I'm sorry, off you trot.
No, they actually even said, sorry, we can't let you go now because you spent so much time here that you must hate the United States. I mean, we were given this argument directly by the policy people at the Pentagon also. Well, they must hate, even if we got it wrong, they must hate us now. So how can we let them go?
Oh God.
Yeah.
Okay. What a reason to keep someone. And also then that when they come back here, they're still subject to that under the force schedule of the ATA and that kind of thing. So they're talking about, there are still wide powers to not give us our rights, restrict our freedom of movement, detain us, that kind of thing. And so you're just like, okay, so we are really applying that again to it's almost like they're being doubly punished for something that they almost...
No, it wrecks your life.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of them were very young from our pool of detainees. A lot of them, when they came back, the young ones, who were in their 20s by the time they were repatriated, they died within 4 or 5 years because... we tried investigating why, but we were shocked to see, I think something like 4 or 5 of them died within the first 3 years of return from just from the abuse that they suffered or, I mean, it was just, these people should not have been dying of natural causes. I'm not saying they were killed. I'm saying that whatever happened to them with their long period of detention under the conditions of detention led to them not being able to live a very long life or just even survive past 3 years. You're right about the system as well. But more than the system, they get away with this because, I mean, if you think about who the detainees were, and we don't talk about it in our second report, right? Because that's a collection of all of the work, that's a collection of all of their stories when they came back. And I think it's one of the largest kind of, collection of testimonies from people who've been released from U.S. detention in the war on terror. What you see again and again, and it's something that I think my lowest point in that case, where I really, really felt. I mean, I'm a fighter and I'm a perpetual optimist, especially when it comes to fighting for our clients. But I think one of my lowest points has to be when I was walking out of the Pentagon, when I'd been given a timeline for when they might be, when the US pullout would happen, and that they had promised that, they'd promised the government of Pakistan, and, it had come to light in the court also that they were going to, send them back to Pakistan, not take them to Gitmo with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was there to ask, what's the timetable for, what are you going to do with these guys, right?
Yeah.
And I'd been there like a year before where they'd said, when we pull out, they'll stay. And they just completely went back on their word.
Okay.
And I didn't know how I was going to go back to Pakistan and tell the families of my clients that that's not going to happen. But I remember distinctly coming down from the stairs to back to the, in DC, like it really, the Pentagon, I call it like, I don't know if you've seen Star Wars, but it's like the Death Star. Okay. And when you go in, you'll see, I mean, some would say it's the US Federation, but I think it's like the Death Star, and you see people in costumes walking around. It's the most surreal experience. But when you come down, going back into the DC Metro from the Pentagon station, on the elevator, there were gigantic ads of US weapons companies like Northrop Grumman and all of these people. And I'm coming down after hearing this and being heartbroken, and I see, the world's latest technology,
right?
These biggest weapons of war being advertised. And I'm thinking, this country, right, is fighting literally, 16-year-old boys, right, from FATA, or a mentally ill, kid who wandered across the, from Balochistan, or, paying for, paying ransom to Pakistanis for handing over their people. How on earth is this a fair fight? What are they afraid of? And look at what they have. And look at who these people are, and they know who they're holding are wrong people. But they won't let them go. This is the imbalance of it. I broke down crying. I was partly screaming in anger and partly crying out of just despair. But it was just such an unequal balance. And, we talk about lawfare, and the law, and international law especially, because it is a reflection of the world order, and it counts on states complying. When the strongest state in the history of the world decides to flaunt it, I think we should take heed from it. And I think that's time for the, like you said, people working in the global south to really demand a change.
And also, so whenever I see how much money is spent on defense, the military-industrial complex, the way it works, and it's phenomenal how much money is being pushed into there, the amount of technology resources that they have at their disposal. And at the same time, I'm like, you fought a 20-year war against these guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan, and you lost, and you left with your tails between your legs. And I think it's just astounding how much money they have, how many resources they have, and yet they don't understand the terrain in which they're fighting in. And
I think it's more like they don't understand the context. I mean, they just have to look at their own history and see they lost in Vietnam. Why did they lose?
Exactly.
I mean, every country's own history is littered with these examples. But if only men in power.
And yet the empire like continues, like they just keep on.
I think we're
needing
seeing
to
the
see
empire crumble, don't you think so?
I wonder, because I'm kind of a bit like, okay, you saw that in Iraq, and then you saw, they were beating the drums again in Iran, and it never happened. And now you see the rise of China, and the kind of, it's playing off against each other. So they're both kind of circling each other now.
I think the empire is not as simple as just one kind. I think the empire's system of control, I think capitalism, we're seeing and in the long, so we're seeing the crumbling of that world order. But in the arc of history is long, right? And so I don't think it's going to happen in 30 years, maybe not even in our lifetime, but we're certainly seeing the beginning of it. And I think it's gotten along at a pretty fast pace, comparable to global warming, in terms of how quickly it's disintegrating. We're watching it happen.
But
also we're watching,
will happen now.
Again, we're watching Russia and other countries behaving in the way that, the United States blatantly did for 20 years. You set that precedent.
Yeah.
Right? And I find it laughable when they call out Putin on, they violated. I mean, where was all of the international law and targeting and all of this stuff when the Israelis do this every couple of years in Palestine?
So I was having this conversation with someone and I was saying that you cannot hold a tribunal against Russia by the same countries that invaded Iraq. You cannot have a tribunal in aggression against Russia by those countries. I do not think it would be legitimate. And then he was like, no, I don't agree. I think you can't be selective like that. You have to start somewhere. I was like, so start with Israel.
Start with your own self.
Clear-cut case in Israel that is an occupying force, is doing apartheid, is doing crimes against humanity, war crimes. It's all documented. Nobody now can sit at the sidelines and be like, this isn't happening. It's happening. So where are we starting and why are we starting?
Exactly. And if you see the institutions that they have set up, right? So for example, suddenly, like, we know from years that the ICC was opening prosecution into, into Afghanistan and all of the powers that were there. We were very excited about it. And there was an excellent prosecutor, Fatu, who was leading the charge. And it took her years. And then the United States, when she got close, they banned anybody that cooperated and they banned her and all of this stuff. But the ICC, case against Russia is like this.
And also when the new prosecutor, who, I thought he was amazing when he came in, Kareem Khan, and then he said, actually, we're not going to look at American war crimes. So this is basically going to be the Taliban, and you're maybe looking at, some Northern Alliance war crimes, but not the Americans. It didn't make any sense to me.
So, but this is what I mean, right? If we start talking about, even with the Israeli conflict, I remember Uwais, who's your director, and I having this conversation a lot, where I was just like, why does everybody talk about, why even on news channels show the visuals and they're powerful enough? And the tide is turning, by the way, in terms of public opinion, even in the United States, because the younger generation stands with the Palestinians. They are not buying the crap that the Israelis government is selling.
Even
so the tide is changing.
Even if their parents are very pro-Israel.
But on TV, on BBC and all these other channels, you still see, they violated targeting stuff. Of course they did, right? But it only matters when they hit like a Reuters office or AFP's office. Suddenly everybody goes up in arms. I remember the strongest pushback on that course when they were talking about targeting. The only time I felt like I wasn't alone was when a bunch of people who were ex-Médecins Sans Frontières, what is it called?
MSF.
MSF, people who had lost colleagues because there was a faulty targeting, which they said it was not faulty, it was deliberate, right? And so they were pushing back during that course when I was screaming about again, this is racist, again, this is against brown bodies, this is problematic legally. But again, the only time that they did talk about it, they said, yeah, she's right, because you guys did this to us in Afghanistan also, or you did that. And they were like, no, but that was within the whatever. And they were like, hell no, that wasn't, right?
The MSF hospital in Good News.
It also matters who was targeted and who hurt, right? Because this whole discussion came about when Israel bombed that tower, the AFP tower. And suddenly it was like, what are you doing?
And it's also because the rest of the time, they can always say but there were militants hiding there.
But this time around, they were
and especially when you hit an MSF hospital, then no. But it's also interesting because the Syrians use that argument all the time. They're like, we hit that hospital, but there were militants hiding
absolutely.
there. So
and Russia, I'm sure Putin's used it a couple of times. So
you're kind of both. It's about the law is a tool, and it's about how you can use it for coercive action and how good you are at using it as well. I always find the Israelis incredibly interesting because I will watch their spokespeople talk, and my brother will be like, what the hell are they saying? It doesn't make any sense. And I'll be like, they're talking entirely legally. So whenever I see Zippy Livni talk, and she's like, oh, this is proportionate.
And the American statements about it are always the same.
And they're all vetted by lawyers, right? Because they know that this is their state practice. This is the kind of law that they're pushing for. And we never have that. We always have people going on and being like, oh, even when the Indians had their attack, and you saw both sides had very weird legal language. It wasn't clear what they were arguing. Is it self-defense? What are you doing? If it is, use the language of self-defense. And you see that the use of that legal language for me is really interesting, because then I'm like, these are the people who, when we eventually have Geneva Convention 5 and 6, they go to the table knowing exactly what they want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and we will be there being like, I don't know.
That's, because I find it really amazing that we don't have enough international lawyers. Like, I'm not an international lawyer, and this is why I love your center, because you guys are the people I call when I need to get my concepts right. And I think it's really critically important. And I think it's even more important for you guys to be advising the state and advising different actors in the state, especially like the Foreign Office, for Christ's sake, and also, a bunch of other, like the Ministry of Human Rights, which I think you guys have worked with, but it needs to be much more.
Definitely.
But as far as human rights lawyers are concerned, when we're looking at, the people that are kind of on the receiving end of, these policies and these laws, and we are trying to make that argument in the public sphere, and we're making that argument to power, or we're making that argument in our courts, right? We need to cut past all of this, because we need to be able to say very clearly what the context is, what the power dynamics are, how their rights are being violated, and what we need to do about it, right? This technical discussion, right?
I wonder very cynically if, because in terms of international law, the main thing is reciprocity, right? So like, why are we going to say, for someone like Abhinandan, I'm not going to go and tell the state, give him his rights, because it would be really nice to do that under this law or whatever. I'm going to be like, hey, the next day you're prisoner of war goes
That's exactly
there,
what we
you
said.
Should, you need to give him those rights, because like it has to be
absolutely. But that's the very simple way of doing it. So
the
only argument that we made in that whole Abhinandan case was that the Pakistan at that time had over 11,000 prisoners imprisoned abroad.
Right.
Legally, illegally, in detention, whatever. And if Pakistan, who has signed the VCCR, the Vienna Convention on Consular Rights, decides to flout that right, you are directly endangering the due process rights of 11,000 Pakistani prisoners abroad. Because no other country is going to owe you that right if you don't follow it. So even though we did not wade into the issue on any other thing, we were very sure that the ICJ, was it the ICJ they went to? That they were going to very categorically come down and say VCCR takes precedence over the other stuff, and you got to give him consular access.
Yeah, and I remember like my first day of like my LLM, first few days, they were like, if you're in a foreign country and you get arrested, you don't say anything, you just say, I want consular access. That's the only thing that you say. You don't need to say anything else. And that is a right that you've had that goes back hundreds of years, from when people would send out their citizens, their nationals to other states, and they were like, no, we need to know that they're protected and we'll protect yours.
Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting when we talk about not giving people that right, especially when it comes to Bagram detainees, because it's really easy then to be like, oh, mistakes are made because you didn't have a lawyer, you didn't have the right to see any evidence against you, you didn't have the right to talk to anybody. You're held like basically incommunicado. So it's really easy then to be like, oh, we didn't know.
We couldn't know. Actually, when they did grant access to the Pakistani government and the High Commission, they granted it after court orders. They granted it regularly. Before also, I think they'd granted it once or twice, but the Pakistanis were not availing that right that much either. Pakistan was always allowed to go to Bagram because we were such close allies in the war on terror. Right. We were also the first ones to go to Gitmo. Like our country was the first one. Our officials were allowed to go into Gitmo. So this is part of our litigation, was really part of getting the Pakistani government to do right by its citizens as well. But it was very interesting because at one point there was some document that landed up in court in which I can't remember. I mean, because the government used to come and file a report before the court and, show proof of all this stuff. So some documents would kind of get slipped in. But I remember distinctly reading the Americans having said something like, you're coming in. So like the Pakistanis would write to the Americans officially, like a diplomatic note or whatever, that we are requesting access to see this national or this national. And then the Americans had written back saying, yes, we're granting you access, but not under the Vienna Convention. Right?
Okay.
And I remember them even at that time saying, but this is not consular access because they're not even under that. And I just remember being like, who cares? You idiots. Like, I just want my guys back, and I want my country to have access. But, too. Like, lanato, I mean, itni bagairti. But anyway, so,
Okay,
But they were very kind of, making they were very sure of like, not falling afoul
that's
of,
really interesting.
they were still playing games with that,
Yeah.
And again, I just keep coming back to the point that we just completely ignored that. And in some way, the Pakistani government not having international lawyers helped. Because if they got distracted by this damn argument, then we wouldn't have seen these guys come home.
Yeah, and also because the right to ask you have a right to ask your state to exercise diplomatic protection on your behalf.
Yes.
So all of the British who were in Gitmo and even the Canadians, they were asking their governments, give us diplomatic protection. They were like, actually, we can choose to give it or not. It's a discretionary right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one of those rights under international law, which is really annoying and frustrating for me because I'm like, you have the right, but it has no teeth.
But it's the right to diplomatic protection, whereas now the thing that has teeth is the right to consular access.
Yes.
So the right to consular protection. Right? Is a better way of framing it. Because the doctrine of diplomatic protection, as it was before, it was really more about the state's obligations vis-a-vis whatever. And it allows
and the state asking for protection on your behalf.
And when you frame it as a diplomatic thing, then it sets in all of this states' rights, states' kind of sensitivity, foreign relations, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But the
courts have always hedged on that side to be like, actually,
So you say like foreign executive priority or foreign relations, and the courts are going to be like, we don't want to be involved. But what was brilliant about Agnes Calamar's report, she was the ex-special rapporteur on extrajudicial arbitrary summary executions. And she came out with the definitive, I think like 3 years ago. I have lost track of time with COVID, but she came out with the definitive scholarship on this, and it came from her office as the rapporteur, where she called it the right to consular assistance. Right? So it's the doctrine of consular protection. That frames this entire obligation on the part of the countries, host and sending state, and the rights, within the rights of the national. Right? Under international human rights law. And also she talks about domestic law. She actually mentions, I think, this case, or because we use the same principle, the Article 4 protections, constitutional protections, to advocate on behalf of Pakistanis imprisoned in the Gulf. Right? Especially on death row. And documenting, again, we went to the Law High Court and we were documenting all of the violations that took place in their trial. And their sentencing and stuff, and making the argument that under our constitution, our state failed in their duty, to secure them due process. They should have intervened when there was a lack of due process. And therefore, the state has an obligation now to come to their aid and right that wrong, either ask for a commutation or get involved or, whatever. And so we love this principle. We love the fact that in our constitution, it's an inalienable right. And we intend to litigate on this principle endlessly.
Okay, awesome. That's good. Well, thank you so much. That was such an interesting discussion.
This is fun.
I think it's good when you've abandoned all of your questions and you're just like,
it might have been, I don't know, maybe too nerdy, but I had a great time.
No, it was really great. Thank you so much. And we hope you enjoyed it at home as much as we enjoyed talking about it. And we hope that you'll tune in for future episodes. Thank you.